comes like that normally.
Sorry, hi everyone, and good evening and welcome to this Bookmarks book launch of Rebellious Daughters of History and other posts from Lockdown 2020. And this event is a special type of event where we'll have the author Judy Cox in conversation with Jan Nielsen. I'll be chairing the event for tonight. My name is Nadia, and I'm a local activist in London as well. And just before we get going with the event, and I hand over to Jan, I just wanted to say, as the event gets going, please, follow Bookmarks on social media. Links to the Instagram and Facebook will be put in the chat throughout the event. So please share this live stream and definitely check out Bookmarks on social media as well. But I'm quite looking forward to the discussion we'll be having this evening. And I'm going to hand over to Jan to get us going.
Hi, and welcome again to what I think is going to be a really exciting meeting. There's been lots of enthusiasm for this on social media. So I think probably I need to ask the very obvious question, Judy. What's the genesis of this book and where did it come from?
Thank you, Jan. I should confess that Jan and I are quite often in conversation, but not often with an audience. So I hope everything feels nice and cosy, and thank you for joining us. I think the book is unique because it was born out of the first COVID lockdown and that feeling of needing to promote resisting the system and to create networks, because if you're a socialist or somebody who wants to resist what's being done to you, then you need to organise with other people. Lockdown is horrible, not only because you're cut off from your friends and family, but because it stops you organising collectively. So looking back to the past to try and find examples, brilliant examples of where women had organised collectively against appalling circumstances really helped to create a kind of national network of people who were all contributing and commenting and coming up with their own ideas of rebellious daughters that they wanted to see included, and writing about their own favourite female resister from the past. So it became quite a collective effort to protest against the conditions of lockdown, really.
Great. And I think it's interesting, isn't it, at a time when so much of the work that women do to keep society going has been so to the fore under the glare. I wondered also about the importance of really, because I heard somebody, I think it was Jane Garvey's on the radio this afternoon, saying it's quite difficult and frightening just to be a woman. And I was just struck at how many of these women led very ordinary lives in periods where there was no forms of effective contraception, menstruation, AIDS, when they were having children, miscarriages, raising children. Was that part of what you wanted to portrayed the real lives of women and the barriers we have to overcome?
I think that's a very important point, because it's always worth remembering when you look at the great examples we have of women fighters, that they didn't have sanitary products, they didn't have painkillers, they didn't have healthcare, they didn't have childcare, they didn't have pensions, all the things that we fought for that actually improve our lives. They struggled without these things, and yet they still provide these incredible examples of courageous and heroic resistance to oppression and inequality. So if you take, for example, Lucy Parsons, who was born into slavery, who married a white man and was driven out of her town by the Ku Klux Klan. The man she married, Albert Parsons, was one of the Haymarket martyrs. He was executed on trumped-up charges after a protest for the 8-hour day, and she still carried on fighting. Fannie Lou Hamer was a great civil rights activist in the 50s and 60s. She went in for a routine operation and was given a hysterectomy, one of many women of colour who suffered that. And yet she still went on to keep fighting. Mother Jones lost her husband and 4 young children in a house fire, but she kept on fighting, and she collectivised that love that she'd had for her own family to fight for the children of striking workers and for children in factories. So these, as you say, it still can be quite scary to be a woman. These are the stories in my book of women who rebelled against slavery, against lynchings, against imperialism, and they fought and they at times won, but they created the basis for us to keep fighting today, a heroic example for us to look back on.
Yeah, well, I was reminded of that, to be honest, when I just quickly was looking through the book, the PDF of the book today. Sojourner Truth sold 4 times into slavery, different, obviously, slave masters, 13 children, illiterate, in bourgeois terms, but yet writes the most astounding, well, doesn't write, she orates, Ain't I a Woman? Which has got to be, I think, one of the seminal pieces of writing about women's oppression and slavery that, I mean, I've ever read. Yeah. What a wonderful. So, that struck me, that particular profile. I also loved in the book, and I wanted to ask you about this, the way that the images that you used, do you think they were important to illustrate these women? And what does it say to us today?
I do. I think the images are very important. And I know on Facebook, lots of people commented on the power of the pictures. And I think partly because you're using Facebook, it needs to be something immediate and arresting to attraction, but also because it makes the women you're describing, or I was describing, so like us, so intimate. It forges that connection with us because they look like people we know, even though they lived 100 years ago and achieved these incredible feats of resistance. They look just like us, and it makes us realize that we share so much. There's so much continuity and so much change. So although our lives have changed a lot, what we're essentially doing by organizing to challenge injustice and oppression hasn't changed. So we might have Facebook. The women we're talking about perhaps had to write, in an old-fashioned way, create their own newspapers, speak in public. Things haven't changed that much. The technicalities, the form of it has changed, but the content has not changed. So when you look at these women and you read their words and their speeches that they made, it echoes so strongly, it resonates with us because we face the same challenges, different forms, but very much the same message and the same opportunities for resistance.
Actually, something I'm going to pick up on, because I was struck as well reading these profiles, how many of these women were writers. I mean, journalists, you could go through, there's dozens of them in this book. Also, always, it seems to me, women who were great orators. Sylvia Pankhurst, obviously, many others. I mean, why do you think so many of them were writers? What was it about what was happening in women's lives, do you think, or something about women's oppression that means that so many very intelligent, combative women ended up being writers?
I think there was women, some women, perhaps more well-to-do women, did have access to writing novels. It was considered to be a slightly more respectable form of expression that was open to women. But I think it's very striking how many of the women we're talking about were journalists. And they were journalists because they wanted to expose the truth about people's working conditions, because they wanted to argue for a different socialist world. Sylvia Pankhurst's a great example. Crystal Eastman campaigned over health and safety at work, and she said this might sound boring, but actually it's health and safety at work that can help you create a revolution, which obviously in times of COVID had huge resonances for us. But I think we stand in that tradition of using journalism to expose what's wrong about the system. Our journalism isn't gossip columns and, you know, recipe columns and how to live a better life by buying things or not buying things. Our journalism is about standing with the oppressed and exposing all the injustices and inequalities around the world. And that's what these women did.
Yeah. And also, again, I was also struck of how many of them, I mean, particularly after the Russian Revolution, were formative members of either the American Communist Party, the British Communist Party. Women certainly didn't have, any of the women you write about, didn't have any aversion to joining political organisations, did they?
No. And I think that is the message, if there is a message, apart from the fact that women are powerful and women, when they organise together, can change the world. It is that our future as fighting for our own liberation is very much tied to the liberation of the whole of the working class. And so all the women in my book considered themselves to be either socialist feminists or socialists. Most of them considered themselves to be socialists because their vision of socialism encompassed the fight for women's liberation. Now, sometimes they had to fight to insert themselves within that because it was not traditional in certain left-wing groups. But I think it's incredibly inspiring to look at something like one of the women in the book is Ada Wright, the mother of two of the Scottsboro Nine. Her two boys, the youngest was 13 years old, and they would have been executed within 2 weeks of being accused of rape on a train had the Communist Party not stepped in. And the Communist Party saved their lives, and hundreds of young black women in Harlem, across the South, and young black men joined the Communist Party because they took a principled stand over fighting racism and over fighting for a more just and fair world. And they took Ada on a speaking tour across Europe. And she was just, as you said, a poor, domestic, illiterate woman who'd never been out of her home state, speaking to audiences in Bethnal Green, in Greenwich, in Dundee, right around Europe. She got arrested, she got deported, but she never stopped fighting. And I think that's how that fight against what happens, you know, women's oppression, racism and class inequality are all linked in many of these women's lives and many of the battles they fought.
Yeah, I mean, again, that was a point. You're reading very often, aren't you, at the start about very young women. And I think virtually every single woman in your book is still a socialist and a fighting socialist till the day they die. Yeah. I mean, you know, there's no sense that as women got older, they became more conservative or satisfied with their lot.
I thought this was one of the most exciting things because obviously we know about the teenagers, the match women. Some people say match girls better because they were teenagers. The young Jewish textile workers in New York. One of the women I talk about is Pritilata Wadaha. She was only 21 when she led a raid on a British club in India, and it had the sign, "No dogs, no Indians" outside. She led the raid, got injured, and took cyanide rather than be captured by the British. She was 21 years old when she did that. And then at the other end of the spectrum, Lucy Parsons that I talked about, she was still speaking to striking workers in 1940 when she was in her 80s. Charlotte Despard, she was in her 80s when she went on a tour of the Soviet Union and decided to join the Communist Party in her 80s. And Mother Jones, again, she claimed to be 100, although some people throw doubt on her claim. She was certainly in her late 90s and still rocking audiences, you know, having people rising up, cheering her. So, you know, hope for us all.
Yeah. And also very relevant, I think, for some of the struggles today. I mean, you only have to look at the fantastic reports from the protests in Poland, scenes of young girls dragging out grandmothers and mothers and grandmothers to join the protest. We saw that in Ireland. I mean, I wondered what you thought were really some of the implications today. I mean, we see the rise of the far right across the world, really, from India with Modi to Brazil with Bolsonaro. The far right always have any gains of women in their sights. So how do you think that relates? What can we get from these stories that help us, do you think, today?
I think the one thing you can guarantee, and the book confirms it, is that where there are attacks, there will be resistance. And so we're talking about women who fought against Franco in the Spanish Civil War, talking about women who fought against the sweatshop labour, who found, however appalling the conditions they were in, they found ways to organise resistance with other people who wanted to challenge the same system. So whenever they attack us, there will be that collective resistance, as we've seen in Poland. And I think perhaps for women, it leads very quickly to big questions, because if you want to fight, it raises the question of who's going to look after the kids. Then it raises the question of how you can control your own fertility and your own body. And at the moment, our bodies have become a battleground between left and right over the question of abortion. Not that the left are attacking us, but the right are attacking us and trying to take away our autonomy and our rights. And the left is fighting for our freedom and for our autonomy. And this has gone on all the way through, hasn't it? You think of the way slave women were treated. You think of the way endemic sexual harassment against women workers. You think of all these times in the past where women have had to rise up and say, fight for their dignity, fight for their collective power, and fight over international questions. That they didn't necessarily start off fighting to change their own lives. They wanted to get the British out of India, or they wanted their children to grow up not being slaves. But of course, in the course of that struggle, then you begin to question your own place in the world, your own right to walk with your head held high. And I think that's one of the great things, is that when you look at these stories, you can see that there are always women who, when they're told to stay silent, will speak up. And when they're told to stay quiet, will organise. And when they're told that they should know their place, will fight back and try and change things. And we will always, always see that resistance. The book is simply to encourage and inspire us with the idea that we're not having to start from scratch every time, that we stand in a tradition of fantastic women fighters.
Yeah, absolutely. And also that they did such magnificent things, didn't they? I mean, it's crazy when you think about it now. In 1954, when Frida Kahlo died, her obituary was really about her being Diego Rivera's wife. But you some of the stories you're telling, I mean, the story about Krupskaya, I was reminded just the enormous task this woman took on in terms of promoting the Bolsheviks' program of education in a society where literacy rates were really, really low. I mean, again, Anessa Armand, actually, I meant to say that when we talked about the photographs. There's a wonderful photograph of Anessa Armand with her 5 children, which in and of itself makes me feel exhausted. And, actually, you think this was the woman who was the, secretary of the Moscow Soviet just after the revolution. That I thought that was wonderful about so many of these stories, the great deeds of social change that these women made happen.
And I think, Jan, it's one of the shocking things is that Sheila Rowbotham wrote Hidden from History. Yeah. And I think about 1973, and we're still fighting for women's role to be taken seriously. And when you look at the kind of revolutionary movements, the French Revolution, the Russian Revolution, even the English Civil War, the English Revolution, they're doubly written out because the revolutionary movements themselves are marginalised. in general sort of teaching of history, and women's role within that is marginalized again. So that if you were the secretary of the Petrograd Soviet, if you were a woman, then historians go, oh, secretary, you know, she must have taken the minutes. If you were a man and you were the secretary, you were providing political leadership.
Absolutely.
So we're still fighting to return people like Elena Stasova, Eugenia Bosch, who led a military unit of the Red Army. These women have been completely written out of history. And if you put them back into history, you can see those revolutions as great acts of emancipation and the potential for women to achieve liberation that's been marginalized again and again. And we're still fighting to put women back in their place in the revolution and the teaching of revolution.
Yeah. I mean, it's desexing the curriculum in a way, isn't it? I mean, there's a part. I don't think it's an accident. There's a thirst for this, actually, at the same time that we're all wanting to know more about the impact of slavery and racism on society. Do you? I mean, I've just finished reading today Pat Barker. You know, there's a lot of books at the moment about even women in Greek mythology. And about looking at these amazing stories. Why had no one thought about this before? It's Christmas 2020 when these books are in the bookshop, isn't it?
It is. No, absolutely. It is. It's shocking how long it's taken.
Absolutely. And I am going to just say this, that behind every one of those profiles, there are then hundreds of other women. I mean, you know, I've been looking at Sylvia Pankhurst, Nora Smythe, a wonderful woman who basically most people don't know or know very little about. But she was loyal to Sylvia Pankhurst, went through all the same political stages, if you like, ending up setting up the Communist Party. So it's like those terracotta soldiers, I think, isn't it? You know, the Chinese terracotta soldiers, you see one, but behind them is the ranks.
An army of others,
An army of women. Sylvia Pankhurst could have done.
And that's something that shaped the book as well, talking about those questions, because, you know, it wasn't that I sort of sat down with a plan to work through these various it was all kind of about responding to what people were saying on Facebook and also the movements that happened. So there's a sudden turn to looking at lots of women, Black women from America and then Black women in Britain who stood up, because obviously the Black Lives Matter suddenly threw these questions open. And similarly, lots of when the Unison went on strike in Tower Hamlets, suddenly I sort of found all these interesting local strikes, and people saying, don't forget the Leeds textile workers strikes, and don't forget the rent strikes in Glasgow in 1915. And suddenly people become inspired, and the book's kind of shaped by those events and people's responses to them as well.
Okay, I think Nadia wants to come in now. Do you, Nadia?
Yeah, well, no, that's all really interesting. And actually, I suppose, we've got a question here from Twitter. And I suppose it connects to what you were saying, Jan, about, you know, whenever we uncover, you know, women in struggles and so on, actually you see hundreds more women that actually are, you know, not at the surface of, you know, when people are reading or learning about any particular event. But the question very much sort of goes on from that. So we've got from Twitter, haven't seen the book yet, so could you tell us the range of women in the book? So Judy.
I think Judy should do that. Go on, Judy.
So there's
where do we start?
The earliest woman, I think, the first woman was from the English Revolution. So she was active in the 1640s on the extreme wing of the English Republicans, so massively to the left of Oliver Cromwell, and she was a leveller. And then right up to people who are still alive today, like Angela Davis, who's made such a fantastic contribution to the struggle against racism. Obviously, it's slightly shaped from my own ability to only speak English, which is a weakness on my part, but has limited the texts I could access a little bit. But I've tried to reflect as much as I could a kind of international struggle as well. So Sanitaire Belair, who was Toussaint Louverture's assistant in the war, in the Haitian Revolution, is in there, as is Nanny of the Maroons, who led a slave rebellion against the British, I think in Jamaica, as is the woman I was talking about earlier, Putilata Wahada. And so but the most of the women in the book are from England or America, simply because that is the language that I can speak. So there's a lot of women from the 19th century, from the abolitionist movement, from the anti-slavery movement. There are some famous women whose relationship with politics has perhaps been written out of history a bit. So Josephine Baker, the amazing singer and dancer, I write more about her role in the civil rights movement. Helen Keller, the fantastic advocate of education for she couldn't hear or see or speak, but she was a fantastic revolutionary socialist. Mary Shelley, people know as Percy Shelley's wife, but she was herself a great activist and wrote very political poetry. So it's attempting to kind of put the political side of famous women back in the picture, and also to look at some of the unknown women who, when you read them, you think, why didn't I know about this woman? Because she just was so amazing. And I was constantly shocked at how many women there are out there who we don't know, and yet we should know.
Yeah. And I totally agree. I mean, I read about people, I'm trying to think, off the top of my head, Adelaide Knight. What an amazing woman, 1894, she marries a black sailor, and the black sailor takes her name, which, must have been so unprecedented in that period. Again, a founding member of the Communist Party, had been involved, I think, in the Russian Revolution. Just, to the person who's asked, I think you'll be, I don't know how many there are in total, Judy. I didn't count them, but how many profiles are there? But there's so many of them. There must be, I don't know, 50, 60 of them or something. And I like to think I'm quite knowledgeable, but I would have thought I didn't know half of them. So that was fantastic to find that out.
Well, I suppose we've got another question from Twitter, which hones in on somebody specific, but somebody's wrote in, do you talk about Mary Barber in Glasgow? She was so important to the defied workers movement. And I suppose that's something appropriate to throw out to the both of you. But Judy, I feel like your face is showing that perhaps you've got an answer to this.
I do actually. Yes, that's a perfect question, because I didn't, but my great friend and a brilliant author and translator, Jack Robertson, messaged me after I'd done one of them and said, did you know about Mary Barber from Glasgow? And I said, well, only a little bit, because they led the rent strikes. And he said, and wrote an entry on her, specifically about her. And he's, an expert on that. So, yes, Mary is in there. Don't worry. There are women from Scotland.
And I think it's asking about their involvement. That's one of the things I think that's really striking, that these women, despite the experience of their own oppression, they're not just fighting to change their own lives, or even to just change women's lives. There's so many connections of these women, like Mary Barber with the Clyde workers movement. You think about Sylvia Pankhurst again in the East End. These women are connected to the workers movement or the abolitionist movement. And there aren't those, they're fighting for a world, aren't they? That's not just about women's liberation, but is about either the liberation of black people in the abolitionist movement, or working class people. Mary Barber's a fantastic example of that. We should all know her name.
We should. And also, I think the international question, because where I live in Tower Hamlets is a very international place anyway. My great friend Farida, who I think is on the call, who I work with, helped me research some of these great women from Bangladesh who are very famous in their own country as educators and resistors, but I didn't know about. So when we started thinking about how could we look at women who had challenged the British presence in India, for example, then I was able to draw on a kind of network of friends and colleagues at work and Facebook friends to help me navigate that path.
Good. That's why it's such a great collaborative exercise. Are there other questions, Nadia, coming in that need to be put to us?
Right. No, but maybe you guys saw the notification from Rhoda Thomas. So she'd asked a question on Facebook as to whether there's any women from Wales in the book.
Oh, I can't remember.
But there's some more questions coming through. Maybe that's going to have a shorter answer, but
Rhoda, for the next one, you have to contribute, okay? For volume 2, I'm looking for Rhoda to contribute on women from Wales. So I don't think there is, Rhoda. No, I can't think offhand if there is. While we're waiting, talking of a collaborative effort, I've got my tech manager here, primed to show some of the pictures. So if that's okay, we're going to take a big risk and do some screen sharing so that people can see the images we're talking about, if that's... so talk amongst yourselves for a sec.
Well, somebody was asking about what's the relevance for feminism today of this book. And I do think one of the things that's really important in this book is just really the point I was trying to emphasize a minute or two ago, that all of these women, even if they're involved with the suffrage movement, the key people that Judy's picked out of this, and the women, you know, we would say were most important, were the women like Sylvia Pankhurst and other suffragettes that Judy covers, who were people who saw or understood that the self-emancipation of women through their own activity was something that was going to be of benefit, not just to them, but to men and their class. And they saw that as central. And I think today, when we look at the feminist movement, you know, we see, again, I'd use the example of Poland. It's not that men are excluded from the movement. There's been lots of examples of men on the demonstrations, farmers protesting in tractors with banners, bus drivers in the centre of Warsaw. When we had the Trump, you know, the reaction by the women's movement at the Trump election in 2016, we saw men involved, men identified with the struggle of women. I think their real relevance between all of those examples that Judy looks at in the book, with, I think, the fight for not just women's liberation, but for socialism. And I think that comes absolutely through, right from all the period that Judy's talking about, from Puritans, the Chartist movement, through the French Revolution to, the suffragette movement, and down to, I think, the one in your book who is probably the most, I still call her Mrs. Desai. We had to call her Mrs. Desai at the time, the most respected black trade unionist, I think, in Britain. You know, she saw the struggle for her against her oppression at work as a struggle of the working class, and so did the postmen and the miners who came on her picket lines.
I think it's also important to reassert the fact that women have always been central to socialism. It's not that you can counterpose, and I think often feminism and socialism gets counterposed. So feminism cares about women's lives and socialism only cares about the class struggle. And it's very important to say women have always, and socialist men have always taken up questions of, as Jan says, fighting for abortion rights, fighting for decent homes in Scotland, in Glasgow in 1915, fighting for decent air, fighting for childcare, all these questions, which some people call, social reproduction, about throughout every aspect of our lives, have always been taken up by the socialists and revolutionary socialists. So I think that's, to me, how it relates, is to say we have this great rich history of women leading socialist organisations to fight over questions of their own liberation and imperialism, racism, class oppression, and that often gets squeezed out of the picture, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. Is there another question, Nadia?
Yeah, there is. Well, perhaps this really takes comment. I suppose I just wanted to draw people's attention to what's been posted from Hilary Tutor. So Nora Haig, if the comment from Hilary can be put back up, that would be really good. Yeah, Nora Haig, teacher sacked in 1917 for refusing to stop protesting against First World War. The local trade council and NUR called for her to be reinstated. She was a member of the ILP and went on to be a national organizer for the Women's Peace Crusade. I mean, do you guys have anything to comment on that from Hilary, who's posted that on Facebook at all?
I think that illustrates what we were saying, doesn't it? You know, again, how these women, it wasn't about individual, you know. I'm really think about, say, Hillary Clinton in the 2016 election, you know, a sort of bourgeois feminist who really went on and on about going through the glass ceiling, didn't she? It was all about how Hillary Clinton was going to be a role model. She was going to, but she just didn't understand that most women had their feet on the sticky floor of low pay and, you know, childcare responsibilities. And that's what's so impressive about these women. The number of them, Judy, that were part of the ILP, as I said, the number of them that were part of the Communist Party, the early communist parties, the number of them also, I think, really very important for today, the number of them that opposed slavery, when we're constantly being told you ought to look back and think about, you know, ideas were different then. Women were very involved in these movements for human emancipation. I think that really comes across, and Hillary's example is a good one.
And I think you can see by the comments in the chat that there are lots of women who are coming up with suggestions of other fantastic women that should have been included in the book. Shirley Franklin and Hillary and so on, and Rhoda are coming up with ideas. So I think we're just going to have to keep going. We're just going to have to keep digging, keep finding these examples in our local histories, in our towns and cities, and maybe look for another edition down the road and keep bringing these women to the fore, fighting for the plaque, fighting for the recognition, fighting to get them on the school curriculum, because it raises all our heads when we know that people have stood up and fought in the past. It makes us reflect on our own practice and think, well, if they could do it in those situations, maybe I shouldn't be moaning about having another Zoom meeting, because actually, you know, we have lots of ways to organise now, but we're still having to slay the same beast of capitalism, and we're still using the basic methods: solidarity, getting the message across, organising collectively, and most importantly of all, never stopping resisting. If it means speaking, if it means acting, if it means organising, if it means protesting, we just don't give up.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think that's a very powerful answer. Obviously, yeah, there are. So we've got on Twitter. So obviously we've been talking about the different movements and so on that we've seen. Somebody's written the huge demonstrations when Trump was elected, when Trump was first elected, were huge, but that has been seen to fade away. Should women be organising separately? And I think this is open for both Jan and Judy to come back on. But let's start with the author, I suppose.
Let's start with me. Sorry. Yeah, I think if women can take the lead, of course, it's very important that if you're defending abortion rights, if you're protesting against Trump, the self-proclaimed pussy grabber, that women are in the lead in those movements. But what we want is the strongest and most powerful movement. So when people talk about, for example, a women's strike, I would say brilliant if women want to lead, brilliant if women want to organise, call the day, call the shots, be the speakers. But I want the biggest strike possible. I don't want to go into a workplace where only the women are on strike. I want them to lead, but I want the maximum solidarity from men as well. So I'm all for women organising, leading, and we understand that because of women's oppression, it's harder for us to speak up, to say, I'll do it, I'll go to the front of the march, I'll propose the motion. We're the ones who are kind of still thinking I can make the tea and take the minutes and so on. And we've got to challenge ourselves and the whole Labour movement on women taking a lead like that. But I want maximum strength, and maximum strength means standing with men, black and white, gay and straight, old and young, to fight questions that affect us, just as we will fight questions that affect everybody, because it's a working class movement at the end of the day.
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree with Judy. And I think, when we see the impact of the growth of the far right across the world, I think that becomes even more, it really becomes, doesn't it, even more important. And there's lessons that we need to learn from our own movement. I mean, I can remember during when abortion was under attack in Britain in the 80s, particularly the Corrie amendment to the 1967 Abortion Act. I think we struck a great victory in Britain when we had, and this was a fight. We had to fight inside the trade union movement for trade unionists to understand that abortion was a class issue. It wasn't just something that affected women. It was something that was about the whole experience of working class family life. And I think that was a great victory to get Len Murray and the TUC to lead that demonstration. And that's why I think in Poland, to be honest, the protests this time have been bigger than they were in 2016 and 2018. And also they're focusing on the criticism of the far right. So I think we have to try, whatever, with women in the lead, we have to build movements where working class men and working class traditional forms of organisation like trade unions take those issues on. And I think we've made progress on those things. I think there is big progress on those things. It's much easier now than it was in the 60s and 70s to raise the question of sexual harassment at work, for instance, in your union branch, whereas that would have been laughed at, literally, in the 60s or the 70s, or the early 70s at least. I think they're asking there, Judy, what was your favourite story from the book? I told you mine. I mean, mine was Adelaide Knight, sorry.
Yeah, Adelaide Knight was fantastic. She sang the red flag every morning to keep her spirits up in prison. She chose to go to prison and left her husband to look after the two little kids. And she was also disabled from childhood polio. So she was quite a remarkable woman. Choosing a favourite would be a bit like choosing one child over another. But as I've only got one child, I don't have to pretend any neutrality or feel any neutrality. I love all of the stories in the book. I particularly love some of the stories where women's lives just seem so unbelievable that if you wrote them, they'd be dismissed as improbable. So Rose Pastor Stokes was born in a Jewish ghetto in Poland at the end of the 19th century. She came to London with a single mother and then emigrated to America with her mother's new husband. She started working in a cigar factory when she was 6 years old. But as a teenager, she developed this skill for writing and wrote for a Yiddish newspaper in New York. She went to interview a very prominent industrialist who was very left-wing and reform-minded, married him. And all the press was saying Cinderella of the sweatshops and actually anti-Semitic headlines as well. But come the First World War, she opposed the war. He didn't. She got arrested for opposing the war, left him, and ended up marrying a communist. And you just think, if you wrote this story of this woman's life. And so I think that is terrific. And all the stories I particularly like. I think Fred's going to try and do me another screenshot, because I would like to show you. I do love Charlotte Despard. I don't know if you saw earlier, because I just, her and Lucy Parsons and Fannie Lou Hammer, back one, please, lovely. That one. So this is Charlotte Despard, and you can see she's probably in her 80s in one shot and probably in her 90s in the other. And she was an Irish nationalist, a supporter of James Connolly. She was a suffragist, and she became a communist in about 1930 after a tour of the Soviet Union. And I love that indefatigable spirit, that response to every political crisis that comes up. You fight, you find a way to organise, and you never give up. Fighting over, yes, all the single issues, but fighting to change the whole world, the one system that breeds all these inequalities and all these injustices. Because by the end of her life, she was like us. She was tired of having to fight over this and fight over that and fight over this. What you want, particularly as you get older, is to see a new world that you can leave for your children. And as we know, in a period of climate change and COVID and economic crisis and everything, we know how important it is. Yeah, you can come back to me if you don't mind. I did want to just say one other thing, if I could, because I think Roger would be very cross with me, Roger, who put the book together, if I forgot to mention that there are also quite a lot of poems in the book.
Yes.
Because it started off as a kind of poem, Rebellious Daughter, and I do want to emphasize the fact that there are some fantastic poems in the book, and I'm just going to give you a little quote, if I may. It's written by a man, but we're going to allow one or two men to sneak in, and it's Robbie Burns, who was writing in 1792 when the French Revolution was in full flow, and he said, "While Europe's eye is fixed on mighty things, the fate of empires and the fall of kings, while quacks of state must each produce his plan, and even children lisp the rights of man, amid this mighty fuss, just let me mention, the rights of women merit some attention." And that kind of summed it up for me. Yes, we can have these great revolutions, but we need to make sure women are at the fore and women's interests and women's demands are being channeled into these revolutionary movements.
And can I just add to that before, if there's another question, I don't know, but I mean, I was just struck by just how much these women crammed into their lives. I mean, there's so many women. I was thinking, is it Larissa Reisner? I mean, she was dead at 30, but, you know, she was a commissar for, you know, the arts under Lunacharsky. She was also a naval commissar. She went to Afghanistan. She was a sort of like a diplomat to Afghanistan, wasn't she? Berlin as well. And this woman was only, I mean, she was 30 when she died. I mean, most people don't fit that in, do they? No. To, you know, a very long lifetime. The way that these women went, and virtually all of them, I think, that Judy's included in the book, all got up and spoke bitterness and raised people's understanding, and they educated and they agitated. And I can see that Michael Dance, who I know is a teacher, is asking, I think he asked in particular, you know, which one would you give to a young woman? I mean, probably off the top of my head, it would be Larissa Reisner, because I just think, you know, cram it all in. On the other hand, I'd be tempted, to be honest, Michael, when there's so much emphasis on, you know, competition with your classmates, I would probably look for the features about women who didn't pass exams, who didn't have qualifications, but managed to do such, you know, fantastic work for the emancipation of humanity. Sojourner Truth obviously comes up immediately to mind. So does Harriet Tubman, in a period when we're trying to decolonise the curriculum. These women have so much to offer, a varied curriculum for children. I'm sure Judy's going to agree with that as a fellow teacher.
Yes, although the children I teach are only 4, so it might be a bit of a stretch for them. But I think I was going through the slideshow looking for a picture. There's a beautiful picture of 2 teenage striking workers in New York, and one's got her sashes in Yiddish and the other one is they're both in English, and they both say abolish wage slavery. And they look younger than my son, who's sitting here helping me with the tech, who's 15. They look so young. And I think that can really reach out, because people look at Greta Thunberg and think, you know, it's exceptional for young people to be fighting. And it's not, because when young people were forced to work, of course, they were amongst the most militant and collectively organised. And women, very young women, fought against slavery, fought against injustice, and particularly sweatshop conditions. And I think that question of the Jewish community in New York is really interesting, because so many Jewish refugees escaped from Russia, particularly at the end of the 19th century, to escape from anti-Semitic pogroms. There was a really vibrant and thriving, quite left-wing Jewish culture in New York, Jewish community. So when the Russian Revolution in 1905 happened, and then again in 1917, it had a huge impact. And I did not know how many American women had gone to Russia after the revolution to take part in the educational experiment, to take part in the social experiment, the housing, trying to live different lives because of that immigration, you know, the forced emigration and exile of Jewish people to America and then back to Russia. And sometimes these kind of international movements carry with them deeply ingrained political messages, which make our world smaller and make our movement more united and effective.
Yeah. And also, I mean, I would add, certainly, again, as a teacher, you know, you think about the vibrancy of these stories and these women, and then you think about comparing them with the politicians that we have today. I mean, you know, America, a country of 380 million people, and yet the best they could come up with for the last election was Biden and Trump. I think that's what this book does. It gives us a real sense of what power from below means. And all of these women who are in the process of changing the world, they change themselves. Because I was really struck, Judy, you know, that you had a little phrase in the introduction in the book which said, this book is about women who refused to stay in their place. I thought that could almost have been the title of the book. And so many of them breaking those kind of expectations, sexual norms, many of them, you know, supporters of what sometimes was called free love, or, you know, who found real meaning in personal relationships, which I think was quite rare for women in previous decades. I don't know whether you know, had children out of wedlock.
It's also worth remembering that Mary Shelley wrote Frankenstein when she was 19.
19, yeah, that's a good one.
So teenagers, you've got to get it on as well. It's not just us that are racing against time. You've got some high barriers. But also in terms of the title, I went to a strike rally the other night, and my friend who's in my Socialist Workers' Party branch in Tower Hamlets, who's also an activist, said, do you know what? I'm a unison activist, but I'm a fire starter. And I thought, oh, if I was to do it again, I'd have that as the title. We need to be fire starters, because we start a fire in our own lives by standing up for ourselves, and we start a fire by uniting with others and resisting the attacks from this government and the inequalities that are built into the priorities of capitalism. So we need more fire starters.
Yeah, yeah. And so many of these women proved absolutely that, didn't they? They must have had, you know, not just with society, but with their personal relationships and families. Fantastic. I don't know if there's any other questions we should answer, Nadia, are there? Or maybe we should ask Judy to make some.
Yeah, no, so I think that's all the questions that we've gotten in. And yeah, Judy, if you'd like to make any last comments before we wrap up, I think it's actually been a really brilliant discussion, not just between the two of you guys, but everyone who's fed in from home with their comments on Twitter and YouTube and Facebook. So if there's anything you'd like to leave everybody with, Judy, I'll hand over to you for that.
Well, obviously a massive thank you to everybody who kind of engaged with me on Facebook when I was doing the posts, who contributed, who made such encouraging comments and contributed on their own favourite Rebellious Daughters. It's clearly opened up a whole kind of casket of ideas of people saying, what about this woman? What about this woman? And it makes you realise how rich our history is in people who refused, in the fire starters. There's so many of them out there that we still don't know about, and we still have to discover while being those kind of fire starters ourselves. And I think for me, one of the most important things is I get so excited when I find an incredible woman I want to share with everybody. And I found a lot because I did an MA and then I'm doing a PhD on women in 19th century. But what really, really excited me to women in history was becoming an active and organised socialist. Because when you are a socialist, it matters. It matters because the examples feed in to what you're doing now. It's not just historical interest, although that is quite fascinating. The biographies of these women are amazing. But it's that their example matters because you want to emulate it in some way. You want to modify it for your own conditions, your own situation. So I really hope people enjoy the book. I really hope people appreciate the fact that it wasn't just me, it's a big collective effort from lots of people, that maybe it's got to be the first edition and lots more people can contribute to the second. And let's all be fire starters, but let's be organised fire starters who know that our interest in history is shaping the past because we want to shape the present, because we want to change the future, because we don't want to have to keep fighting and enduring and resisting. We want to win. We want to triumph. We want to establish a different world. We want to fulfill all our human potential and all our creativity. And to do that, we have to organise and we have to fight. We have to make the past come alive in the present and in the future.
Wonderful.
Thank you very much for that, Judy, and also to Jan for really facilitating that discussion and so on, and also obviously to everyone who fed into him too. Yeah, I just wanted to reiterate, even though it's trailing along at the bottom bar as well, you know, I encourage everyone to pre-order the book from Bookmarks, which will be out in the new year. I can see already there was lots of comments popping up saying I'm definitely getting this. I feel encouraged to start fires elsewhere and so on. So that's brilliant. And yeah, I suppose keep up with Bookmarks' social media to find out the next live event. But thanks to everyone and solidarity.
Okay, thank you all. Thank you for joining us. Bye.